In the annals of British history, there exists one moment so powerful and controversial that it continues to echo through the centuries. A moment so dark that it not only marked the end of an era, but also irrevocably altered the course of the British monarchy. It was the execution of King Charles I on January 30th, 1649. His death is not simply a tragic event, but the symbol of a nation torn between power, politics, and its very identity. And what they did to him still haunts British history to this day. The year was 1649, and England was in turmoil. The country had been ravaged by a brutal civil war that had split families, divided loyalties, and led to the rise of a new political force, the parliamentarians. The conflict between King Charles I and Parliament had reached its peak. Charles, a monarch who believed in the divine right of kings, saw himself as the supreme ruler, accountable only to God, not to the people or their representatives. His refusal to work with Parliament and his tendency to rule without their consent had pushed the country to the brink. But the parliamentarians, led by figures such as Oliver Cromwell, viewed this as tyranny. The tension between them escalated until it turned into outright war. The war had left the king in a desperate position. With the defeat of his royalist forces in 1646, Charles was captured. For years he had tried to maintain his authority, but the parliamentarians, now in control, demanded that he answer for his actions. The charges were grave: high treason, betrayal of the nation, and the attempt to subjugate the people to his absolute will. The very foundations of England's government were being questioned. Could the monarchy, which had reigned for centuries, continue in the face of such defiance? Charles was tried in what many considered an unlawful court, with its members chosen by those who had already pledged allegiance to Parliament. He stood before them, regal and defiant, refusing to accept their authority. He argued that as king, he was above the laws of the land, that his power was divinely ordained. But this was no longer the age of unquestioning loyalty to monarchs. The world was changing, and the people were demanding a voice. The trial of Charles I was not just about his actions, but about the very nature of power itself. As the trial proceeded, Charles's refusal to cooperate only deepened the anger of his accusers. He was found guilty, and the sentence was one that no one could have imagined just a few decades earlier: death. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles I was led to the scaffold at the banqueting house in Whitehall, London. Thousands gathered, and in the freezing cold air, they watched as a king was condemned to die. This was not simply the end of a monarch's life, but a public spectacle, a statement of power by those who had taken control of the country. Charles's execution was not swift or silent. He was made to endure the humiliation of being stripped of his royal status, of facing the public as a condemned criminal. His royal robes, symbols of his divinely appointed reign, were replaced by the simple garb of a prisoner. He stood before the people, alone and vulnerable, his crown and scepter lost forever. As he ascended the scaffold, he spoke his famous last words: "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown." This statement, both mournful and defiant, reflected his belief that his death would mark not only the end of his earthly reign, but also a passage to an eternal kingdom, one where his authority would be beyond challenge. But what they did to him wasn't just about killing a king. It was about publicly dethroning the idea of monarchy itself. The execution of Charles I shattered the divine right of kings, a doctrine that had upheld the monarchy for centuries. It was no longer enough for a monarch to claim divine right. Now they would be held accountable for their actions, for the way they governed, and for the lives of their people. Charles's death was not merely a political execution. It was a profound act of rebellion against the monarchy itself. As the axe fell, Charles I's life was ended. The crowd was silent. The country was left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. The monarchy, once an untouchable institution, had been brought to its knees. The nation, once united under a single ruler, was now divided. The death of the king did not bring peace. It ushered in a new era of uncertainty, with the rise of the Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell. England had briefly abandoned monarchy, but the wounds left by Charles's execution would be felt for generations. What they did to him still haunts British history. The events surrounding Charles I's death were not just about a king who died, it was about a nation that irrevocably altered its course. The monarchy would never again hold the same power, and the consequences of that moment still resonate today. The execution of Charles I became a symbol of the fragility of power and a warning that even the mightiest could fall. It was a turning point, a moment that forever changed the relationship between the crown and the people, and left a legacy that still echoes in the halls of British history. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 was not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a new and tumultuous chapter in British history. The monarchy, once an unwavering symbol of power and authority, was in ruins. What followed was a period of profound uncertainty, the repercussions of which would ripple through the centuries. While Charles I's death may have initially seemed like a triumph for the forces of Parliament, it set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundations of England's political system. In the immediate aftermath of his death, England found itself without a monarch. The country was in a state of shock and its future uncertain. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentarians and the man most responsible for the king's downfall, took the reins of power. He did not seek the throne for himself, but instead established the Commonwealth, a republican form of government that was meant to replace the monarchy. For the first time in history, England was a nation without a king. Yet, despite Cromwell's power, the death of Charles I left a void that could not be easily filled. The monarchy had been an integral part of England's identity for centuries, and the people, though initially supportive of the execution, soon began to feel the absence of royal leadership. The ideals of republicanism, which had seemed so promising, began to falter under Cromwell's rule. He, too, was not immune to the dangers of absolute power. His reign was marked by conflict, religious strife, and the heavy hand of military rule. Cromwell's efforts to create a free republic were marred by his authoritarian methods, and by the time of his death in 1658, England was longing for the return of monarchy. What followed was a period of instability known as the interregnum, a time when the country was torn between republican ideals and the longing for royal restoration. It was clear that the monarchy could not be simply erased from the nation's consciousness. The execution of Charles I, rather than ending the monarchy, had merely buried it beneath the surface, waiting to rise again. In 1660, just over a decade after Charles's execution, the monarchy was restored under his son, Charles II. The English people, weary from years of turmoil and the failure of republican rule, welcomed the return of the king. Charles II was crowned with great fanfare, and the monarchy was reinstated, but the legacy of his father's death still lingered in the minds of many. Though the monarchy had returned, it was never quite the same. The balance of power between the monarchy and Parliament had shifted irrevocably. Charles's death had shown the world that the king was no longer untouchable. The notion of divine right, once held as the cornerstone of royal authority, had been dealt a fatal blow. The execution was a bold statement that no monarch could ever again rule without regard for the will of the people. It wasn't just Charles I who had been condemned, it was the entire system of unchecked monarchical power. Though the monarchy would return, it would never again hold absolute power. Parliament, strengthened by the events of the Civil War and the execution, would play a central role in the governance of England for centuries to come. Even in the years following the restoration of the monarchy, The memory of Charles I's execution haunted both the royal family and the people. The king's death became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, and the monarchy was forever shaped by the trauma of that moment. Charles I's tragic end served as a reminder that the monarchy could be toppled, and that the people had the power to challenge even the most powerful institution in the land. Moreover, the execution of Charles I played a critical role in the eventual development of constitutional monarchy in Britain. The events of the 17th century, including the Glorious Revolution of 1688, would lead to a shift in the power dynamics between the monarchy and Parliament, with the monarch's role becoming largely ceremonial. The monarch would no longer be the absolute ruler, but would govern alongside an elected body, with the power of the crown greatly diminished. Even today, the execution of Charles I continues to cast a shadow over the British monarchy. It remains a powerful symbol of the fragility of power, a reminder that no institution, no matter how mighty, is immune to the will of the people. The echoes of that fateful day in 1649 still resonate in the halls of Parliament and in the monarchy itself, shaping the relationship between the crown and the government. Charles I's death left an indelible mark on British history, one that would not be easily erased. It raised questions about the nature of power, governance, and the rights of individuals, questions that would continue to shape the political landscape of Britain for centuries. Though the monarchy was restored, the memory of what had been done to Charles I served as a constant reminder that power, even royal power, could be challenged. What they did to him still haunts British history, not as a mere tale of a king's execution, but as a profound turning point that forever altered the relationship between the people and their rulers.